Today's session we've got a very special guest to come and talk about his extensive research on CLR James. This year will mark 90 years since his initial stay here in Nelson up on Meredith Street. So this sort of event that we put on today is sort of goes in some small way to commemorate that, hopefully. So it's now my pleasure to pass you on to Christian. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks everyone very much for coming along. Thanks to Nelson Library. Thanks to Building Bridges in Pendle. And it's really great to be back here. I haven't been when I did my research on CLR James in Nelson back in the 2000s when I was doing a PhD over at University of York. And one of the first places I came was to Nelson Library, and it was always amazing obviously you could look through the Nelson Leader and stuff, but it had all these kind of other cuttings and stuff as well. So it was really a testament to the archive that had been built up around CLR James here, and obviously Louis Constantine as well here. But so it made doing research really quite easy and delight to do. And when my book finally came out in 2014, with a chapter on CLR James and Nelson, it was really proud to be able to come back here and do like the first book launch here. It was like the most obvious place to go to launch the book, and so it's really tremendous to be back here, given Nelson's really rich history, which other people here will know more about than me, really. But hopefully we will time for discussion and things, and I'll learn, I'm sure, lots more about Nelson and thinking about James's time here. CLR James, recent biography came out of him called CLR James, A Life Beyond Boundaries, by John L. Williams. It's really very, very good biography, came out I think last year. And that subtitle, Life Beyond Boundaries, I think sums up in many ways something quite important about CLR James. Obviously it alludes to his great work Beyond a Boundary, which I'm sure people know, which is kind of his semi-autobiographical kind of cultural history of cricket, and particularly in relation to the West Indies, and that book obviously has quite a lot about Nelson in it. So obviously that's a key sort of place to go to understand CLR James's time in Nelson, which he describes really vividly in there. I thought I'd wear my CLR James T-shirt with that quote from Beyond a Boundary there. What do they know of cricket? Who only cricket know? Basically saying, you need to look beyond the boundary of a field and understand wider society, wider social relations and wider politics and life outside it, as well as understanding obviously the intricacies of what goes on the cricket field. And James was riffing off Rudyard Kipling poem, The English Flag, I think, of what should they know of England who only England know. The sense that you can't really understand just England itself without understanding, this is the 1890s, I think Kipling's making this point, the whole of the empire, which at that time Britain dominated. And CLR James, born in 1901 in Trinidad, in colonial Trinidad, a kind of tiny outpost of that empire. This is a story of someone, black colonial subject from the West Indies, coming into what was then the imperial metropole of Britain in 1932, and at a time when we're remembering the Windrush generation and Windrush Day earlier this week, and we're kind of commemorating the struggles Windrush generation went through against racism. It's worth reflecting on the fact that black British history obviously doesn't begin with Windrush, as important as Windrush was. We had people, Constantine, James, but going back obviously hundreds of years before that, that engagement between black people and British society. But it's also, I suppose it's interesting. James went to America in 1938. He was in Britain from 1932 to 1938. That's the period I was described in my book, that period. And then he went to America. And so he was there until 1953, when rising McCarthyism forced him out. And it's interesting to reflect, had James, of course, back to Britain, ironically, but had James been in Britain, I think, during 48, when Windrush generation started to happen, and been there from the start, he could, had he wanted, have been, really much more famous even than he's known. He's quite famous, but he's also quite unknown. The details of his life are quite unknown, James. compared to some other figures. Still, in terms of black history, but I think had he wanted to, had he been in Britain and stayed there, he would be one of the recognised as so very famous in terms of he would have been a leading political figure representing Black Britain when it came in and representing and being there, championing those struggles. By the time he came back, in 1953, he'd because he'd been out of the country for 15 years. On one level, he was quite isolated, kind of marginalised, and he had to took him a while to sort of find his bearings. And then it wasn't until things like Beyond the Boundary, writing that in 1963, when that came out, that he started to become sort of a bit better known and remembered again in Britain. And really in the 80s, when he was living in Brixton with the Race Today collective, that's when he really became, again, discovered, if you like. People suddenly discovered here was someone in their midst who'd met people like Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King, Leon Trotsky, and so on, had this amazing life. And Stuart Hall, late Jamaican sociologist, once said James was like this Renaissance man. His whole wide range of interests. Beloved game of cricket, obviously part of that, but also other kind of, if you think about sort of Caribbean cultural traditions, calypso, carnival. James wrote, he lived those kind of cultures, and as they kind of emerged and developed really in many ways in the early 20th century, wrote about those. He wrote about art, though, from Michelangelo, Jackson Pollock. He obviously is a historian, a brilliant historian, one of the most important black historians of the 20th century, alongside people like W.B. Du Bois or Eric Williams, whose work Capitalism and Slavery has been what we published last year and again got a lot of attention. James's work Black Jacobins, about the Haitian Revolution, about its intermingling with the French Revolution. But he also wrote on Greek tragedy, Marxist theory, other revolutions in his lifetime, the Spanish Revolution, Hungarian Revolution. But obviously the struggle for colonial independence, Pan-Africanism, that was a key part of his life. But also American culture, movies, Hollywood, American comics. He wrote on literature, from Herman Melville's Moby Dick. He wrote a great little book, Mariners, Renegades and Castaways, which actually is 53, so 70th anniversary this year of that book. And wrote on Toni Morrison, Black American writer. So Stuart Hall said, no one person would dream of having all those lives, of living in these, what he called kind of 3 or 4 completely different worlds. And Stuart Hall said, you could say if your curriculum was to know about things which James knew about, you would come out of that process knowing about the world, understanding the modern world. You would have eaten broken bread with the dramas, with the big things that have made the modern world. And obviously I'm not going to be able to do justice to the whole of James's talk. I'm going to really focus on Nelson here. But I suppose it's worth having some sense of James, as Paul Buell, his authorised biographer, once described him, one of the few truly creative Marxists from the 1930s to the 1950s, perhaps alone in his masterful synthesis of world history, philosophy, government, mass life and popular culture. So as I say, I'm going to focus on Nelson and the 10 months which shook James's world from arriving in May 1932 and then leaving in March 1933 here. Time of the Great Depression, and he'd come from this materially impoverished kind of West Indian colony, looking to kind of make a living for himself really as a writer. That's part of why he sort of came here. He'd been a writer, they'd written Minty Alley, this draft of what became Minty Alley was published in 1936 when he was in Britain, a bit later on. He'd written that, and he'd written short stories, and he was well known as a kind of writer in Trinidad, but you're unable to make a living at that time as a writer in Trinidad. There was no market, there wasn't enough of a market there. And so, you had to leave really if you wanted to do that, and you had to leave at that time. James was a pioneering figure in that sense of kind of in terms of West Indian literature. Minty Alley was one of the first books by a black author, not the first, but one of the first black West Indian author to be published in Britain, novel. And I think it's interesting as well to reflect, as I say, this way that James was shaped by his experience of meeting the English working class community of Nelson here. And I think had he not come here, hi, welcome, had he not Yeah, had he stayed in London, because he first arrived in London, his little time in London, short 3-month period he spent in London, has been published. He wrote back to the Port of Spain Gazette, and that's been published as a nice little book called Letters from London. But had James just stayed in London, which he found a quite cold kind of city, experienced racism and stuff there, had he just stayed there, he would have radicalised, I think, to the left in the period of the 1930s, given the big themes of crisis, catastrophe, the rise of fascism, so on, mass unemployment and everything going on at that time, one of the real great crises of capitalism, probably greatest crisis of capitalism happening right then. But I think he would have stayed. Probably stayed primarily as a writer, really, someone who was, political, obviously, but primarily seeing himself as a kind of still a literary figure. And I think it's his time in Nelson that sort of helps shift him, as he says, from literature into politics, which we'll come and talk more about, and helps him become, this one of the most creative and important, sort of revolutionary Marxists of his generation, and helped change the way really half the British left thought about questions of empire and race, alongside his compatriot, people like George Padmore, important Pan-Africanist figure, also from Trinidad, boyhood friend, and other activists, key activists, people like Amy Ashwood Garvey and so on, and here. So, but the reason he came here to Nelson really is Leary Constantine. Now, what I was going to do is I'll show you this first image, which is. There's brilliant display of cuttings down below, so you can look at the detail down there yourself there. But this is a kind of great image from 1938, I think, where there was a kind of a sort of charity match kind of thing played there. But you could see there, and you can go and look down at the thing yourself. But people like Leary Constantine, George Headley. Joseph Robinson was the mayor. I met Eric Robinson, who showed me around Nelson back in the 2000s. I don't know if anyone ever met him, but I was really privileged to have a guided tour with him around Nelson when I was first starting out my research. Joseph Robinson was the mayor. There's also people like Peter Milliard there, I think, who was from British Guiana. He had a really fascinating life. Worked on Panama Canal, became a medical student, was involved in London, Manchester actually, in the Pan-African Federation, played a key role in the 5th Pan-African Congress, in Manchester in 45. There's many professionals who played in the Lancashire League at the time. And I'm just going to show you've probably seen it, but it's just such an amazing thing. So I'll just end the slideshow. It's this little film from 1976, a little clip from it, when called Beyond a Boundary, Mike Dibb directed, which is CLR James returning to Nelson in 1976. We might check the sound actually. Probably. I don't know about this.
Lead professional at Nelson in Lancashire.
Okay.
The Constantines were watched, central figures on the stage all the time, ambassadors for Trinidad and the coloured races. In their 4th summer, 1932, the household took in a lodger. CLR James cannot have been the easiest of guests in a 4-roomed house with no garden and a lively 4-year-old child. He was a Trinidadian with ambitions to write and some abilities as a cricketer. He kept late hours, read intensely, and was deeply interested in politics.
I came to Nelson because Constantine had told me in Trinidad that if I wanted to come to England to write and I hadn't enough money, come on, and if I didn't do so as well as I should, I could come to live with him. Well, my money disappeared in 3 months, so I told him, I have no money. He says, come up here. And I came to Nelson and stayed here. Now, it had a remarkable influence on my life and on his, because Nelson was a place that was loaded with all sorts of advanced politics. And the whole political atmosphere in England and Nelson made me very much aware of actual concrete politics, not merely wishing, but doing something about it if I could. And Leary had similar ideas. But one thing I must say for him, he said, I am here to play cricket and I will have nothing to say about your cricket. But I would go about and they would ask him to speak, and then he would tell me, come along, and I would go, and they would ask me if I would say a few words, and I would look at him and he would say, go ahead, I would say a few words. He said nothing. What I remember he would do, he would laugh a lot at some of the things I said, because I believe he would have liked to say them, but he knew that he wasn't going to do that, not while he was playing cricket. I wouldn't be surprised if I got into politics here and began to see, as a newly bred Marxist, politics from a more international point of view. And we concentrated on Africa, Padmore and the rest of us. Constantine remained a West Indian, 100% West Indian. And he was interested in what we were doing, but he was, in a very precise sense, more West Indian than I was. When I got into it, my mind was generally for the world revolution, and chiefly Africa as well as Europe.
Did it affect your cricket much, and the way in which you viewed cricket?
It did. I came here and began to see cricket for what it was, a part of the society. It had been much more of a part of the society in the Caribbean than it was, but I hadn't thought of it as such. But in England I began to understand a lot of things, and as time passed on, much of my cricket experience in the Caribbean acquired historical and logical shape and form in Britain here.
Where have you been this last few years in America? You thought you were a cowboy straight from Texas with you.
No, I'm a legitimate brother of Mr. President Trump.
Still got the same old roll, what we have in the bush.
You remember the roller? We got that roller, we can only trace it back as far as 1923 and it's still running perfect. Remember the big heavy roller? We're wondering whether that Duke down south that buys all these old cars might make us a big offer so we can buy a new one with it.
What do you want to buy a new one for?
Were you writing a lot then? That was your main profession, writing?
Writing?
I used to remember you speaking on that box by the old...
yes, but I used to do a lot for the Manchester Guardian.
A little to the left, would I describe
I
it?
should think somewhat more.
Have you matured, or shall I say, mellowed since those days?
I have developed.
I would say mellowed, like we all do.
No,
I mean, there's 1, 2, 3, 4,
I would say
5 old chaps here, and I'm the youngest, by the way. Although I say it myself, and there's a few here, it was a damn good amateur side, with a first-class professional. Leary was so keen, he got everybody else exceptionally keen, and then with a wonderful balanced side. This was the beauty of it to me.
Nelson won the league 7 times out of 9 or something.
Our chairman then, Mr. Tom Morgan, I think was the first to get in touch, get the idea of getting Constantine to come here. And they went to Manchester in the first place, and from then on there was no negotiation going on all the time until he signed in 29. When he came to Nelson, he was the only black man in Nelson. Everybody looked at him whether they were cricket enthusiasts or not, and he felt it.
I would say they were more inquisitive rather than...
It was.
And I think Leary took that the wrong way once or twice.
He did.
That was my honest opinion.
Well, I was here in 33 and I used to come up and down, and after a time, well, there's nothing of use to go to all look at. That was a fine stroke.
Oh, to say the same
And Milburn's at that end.
Yeah, Melbourne made a stroke. There was something about the West Indian Saturday game that the English players, dominated by the county cricket mentality, had lost. What Leary did in 28, he brought that in, and he was quite at home in the one-day game.
Yes, he was very much at
Very much at home, and he was such an all-rounder. Bowler, batsman, fielding. So whenever he was on the field, you had to watch him.
And here he was very fast and very hostile and very sensible. If he hit somebody, he didn't stand like Truman, stick him up on like he went to rub it. But the next ball was just as bad, you know.
When people like Sidney Burns came here, there was, in addition to the game, there was what would Larry do with them and what would they do with him. It was like in a baseball game when a batsman come in and a spread pitcher is there to, that used to happen. So in addition to the general competence of the game, there was something very concerned about what he would do and what the others would do with him, because a bowler who came here wanted to get him out, and Larry knew that.
Sidney Barnes is generally admitted to be the greatest bowler cricket has yet seen. I had a glimpse of him the other day in action. When Constantine came in, I looked for a duel. Constantine was not going to be drawn into playing forward. Barnes was not going to bowl short, to be hooked over the pavilion, or over pitch to be hit into the football field. Constantine also was not going to chance it, for on that turning wicket to such accurate bowling, he who chanced it was lost. Barnes bowled a slow one that might almost be called short. Constantine shaped for the forcing backstroke, but even as he raised himself for the stroke, he held his hand, and wisely. The ball popped up and turned many inches. Another ball or two, and again Barnes dropped another on the same spot. It was a sore temptation. Constantine shaped again for his stroke, his own stroke, and again he held his hand, wisely. Was this recitative suddenly to burst into the melody of fours and sixes to all parts of the field? In the years to come, it will be something to say that we have seen him.
Yeah, sorry to have to stop it there. So it's on YouTube, so people can go and watch the whole thing. It's a truly fantastic film. It's just called Beyond the Boundary. If you if you just look up Beyond the Boundary YouTube, I once bought the little disc of Mike Dear. I probably shouldn't say this actually. But anyway, he sort of gave it with a kind of nod and wink to say, can you kind of get it onto YouTube somehow? Because he didn't have the rights to it. Anyway, it found its way onto YouTube somehow. It's had a lot of thousands of views, but it's which is tremendous. Because it's an absolutely brilliant film, the whole thing. A real treat. So, Constantine, I mean, audience here, people kind of know this. He'd been part of the West Indies team that toured Britain in 1923, and been invited to stay and turn professional by Nelson Cricket Club when he returned in 1929 to play in the Lancashire League. He would return back to Trinidad most winters, and there he'd talk to CLR James about Britain, about cricket, and so on, and invited James to work on his autobiography called Cricket and I, and so that was one of the reasons why when James came to Britain, he was able to come up and stay here with in Nelson with a house that Leary shared with his wife Norma and their 4-year-old daughter Gloria, and so in Nelson you had the kind of Salem, the Independent Methodist Chapel, which was kind of Nelson's spiritual centre at the time. You had a kind of Weavers Institute, the base of Nelson's Weavers Association, which was kind of its social centre at the time. The ILP's Vernon Street headquarters, perhaps its political centre, and then Seed Hill, which you saw there, home of Nelson Cricket Club, because its artistic centre. And Lancashire League cricket, obviously formed in 1890, imbued with this democratic spirit, was hugely popular, fed off and contributed to kind of inter-town rivalries. You'd have crowds of 8,000 to 10,000 common when Nelson played at home, sometimes even bigger. Hundreds of people would gather to watch the weekday evening practices in the nets. And matches would take place at a time and a place convenient to almost all, every Saturday afternoon during the summer, starting roughly at 2 p.m, finishing at around 7 p.m, with a 15-minute interval between innings. And it had this huge working class following. And unlike some more prestigious matches where rain and light conditions would stop play at certain times, Lancashire League cricketers continued playing in all but the worst of conditions, which also contributed to its popularity. And Constantine's outstanding performances, as I mentioned, he was kind of an all-rounder. but especially his kind of short-range catching. He's described as being as quick as a cat after a mouse. Sometimes he'd catch the ball and put it in his pocket before anyone realised where it had gone, and things like that. Humour. And his speed as well. He acquired the nickname Electric Heels, apparently, and that helped establish Nelson's dominance over the rest of the league, but also inspired people at a time of economic hardship. As one Nelson resident, Ken Hartley, remembered, Constantine's cricket took people away from the drudgery of cotton weaving, the insecurity that was in the air at that time. He was a light at a time of despondency. The majority of people worshipped him. Well, alluded there to some of the kind of early examples of kind of everyday racism that Constantine experienced when he first arrived, I think, at Nelson. But by the time James arrived, Constantine had become this kind of legend. And James remembered he travelled that first summer in Nelson in Constantine's orbit, and he never really left that orbit throughout the time in Britain in the 30s. And even afterwards, they had political differences around later in Trinidadian politics. Constantine became a part of Eric Williams's government, and the PNM, People's National Movement chairman, I think, at one time, whereas James fell out with Eric Williams in the 1960s over Williams's support for American imperialism, essentially. And so there were tensions later on, but they always managed to kind of navigate and retain this enormous respect for each other despite some of the difficulties. And the Constantine Archive, if you ever go to Trinidad, go to Port of Spain, go to this thing called NALIS, which is a big library, National Archive there, and they've got this amazingly rich collection. It's Constantine's papers, and it's incredibly rich, and it's just fascinating. It's just amazing, the amount of stuff there. And there's a book by Geoffrey Hill, I don't know if he's here today, but he's a historian of Nelson. He's also wrote a book on Leary Constantine and race and empire. In the way that Constantine's often just remembered as a cricketer, but he was an important anti-racist activist, particularly in Britain as well, throughout his life. And at the time of the Bristol bus boycott against what's called the colour bar institutional racism in the 60s, Constantine was worked for the embassy. He was basically Trinidad's representative in Britain, I don't know, the ambassador maybe, but he had this high-ranking role where he was supposed to be kind of above politics, but Constantine sided with those in Bristol resisting racism, which kind of meant he was kind of shunted out there ultimately. But he was always somebody who really fought passionately against racism in his own way, and Geoffrey Hill's book helps bring that aspect of his life there out. But Constantine's, at the time James arrived, Constantine's career, that year, his batting had got off to a bad start, and he had enormous pressure on him because he was well paid, professional, expected to deliver, and when you're a bit off form, there's huge pressure on Constantine, and James was living with him at the time, could see that pressure on Constantine, and so when another club, because James used to play cricket, he was quite good himself. When he was offered by Radcliffe after one game to see if he wanted to play for them as a professional, he turned them down. James remembered, he said, "I badly needed some money. I love to play cricket," but my reply was instantaneous. "Who? Me? To go out there to bat, knowing that they've paid me, and to make naught? No, thank you." You can see the pressures on you are there. And instead, as it shows there, he managed to get this job as a really privileged job, really, at the time, as a sports reporter working with Neville Cardis for the Manchester Guardian, after writing that article on Sydney Barnes, which the film showed there. And he worked for the Manchester Guardian from sort of 33, covering maybe Lancashire League matches, 33 to 35. And then he came back in the 50s and had a couple of years working for the Manchester Guardian as well in the 50s. And this was, for a black colonial subject, really, to be employed on such a prestigious post as journalist on one of the leading daily journals of Britain itself, was this tremendous personal achievement. He said it was a great feeling to sit beside the Times in the number one seat allowed to the Manchester Guardian at Old Trafford, Lancashire's home cricket ground, and it gave him this opportunity to really kind of look at this game as it's played in national game, really, in many ways in Britain there. So James mentioned earlier was born in. Let's skip a slide. This is young James just about 1933, I think. This is when he was here. He'd born into kind of a lower black middle class. His father was a teacher, and he himself taught history and English in Trinidad. This seeing the kind of the contradictions then of the hypocrisy of kind of rule, the way that Britain boasted of being this great democracy and stuff, but essentially had a colonial dictatorship in places like Trinidad, there radicalised him, and he moved in Trinidad from a kind of liberal humanism to a kind of sort of parliamentary socialism, looking to the kind of Labour Party. As I mentioned, he came to Britain with two manuscripts: a draft novel, Minty Alley, which is about the working people in Port of Spain, in one of what's called the kind of barrack yards, and mainly women, ordinary women's lives. Basically, it was one of his early novels actually looking at ordinary people's lives in terms of West Indian literature. But also the other manuscript he brought with him was this book called The Life of Captain Cipriani, who you can see pictured there, who was the leader of Trinidad's Working Men's Association at the time, this mass sort of social democratic nationalist organisation wanting self-government. Cipriani, he wasn't the most radical figure initially. But he'd been this commander of West Indian Regiment during the First World War, and he'd stood up for the black. He was of kind of Portuguese kind of descent, I think, but he'd stood up for the black troops against the kind of institutional racism of the British Army. They mutinied at Taranto in 1918 in southern Italy, right at the end of the war. And he'd stood up for them and became this kind of champion of, he called it the barefooted man, if you like, of ordinary people. And James's biography of Cipriani tore into the British government line, which was kind of, you could have self-government when you were fit for it. That's how it was, really. So you had to wait, you had to learn the niceties of Westminster democracy and, free from corruption, all this stuff, and so on. And we need to learn about this kind of, this style of democracy. And but he argued, no, the growth of this mass social democratic nationalist organisation proved, if proof was needed, that black West Indians were now, were fully ready for self-government right now as well. We didn't just have to wait. And this was published in 1932 in Nelson here. And with the help of Constantine, he said, until he moved in with Constantine, James recalled, I doubt if he and I had ever talked from 5 consecutive minutes on West Indian politics. Within 5 weeks, we'd unearthed the politician in each other. And he showed the manuscript of Cipriani to Constantine and said he one day hoped to get it published. Constantine was supportive. He said, go ahead, find out what it will cost, I'll pay. When you sell the copies at home, back in Trinidad, you can pay me back. And it was published, it was printer Frederick Cartmel, who'd also, he'd been in the First World War as a tank commander during the First World War. He owned this press called Colton and Co. And he agreed to publish, The Life of Captain Cipriani, subtitled An Account of British Government in the West Indies. And copies were sent back to Trinidad. It became this, popular, great, success. And it helped to ideologically arm some of those who would then become the leaders of the struggle for kind of Caribbean independence. So these, and late 30s, there were these big mass strikes and labour rebellions across the Caribbean because of the unemployment and poverty. They're suffering during the Great Depression period. Most of them quite brutally repressed. And James himself had actually seen a big strike in 1919. There was a mass strike across the waterfront in Port of Spain, mainly by dock workers. And it's interesting when he wrote this, because he'd written it all basically before he became to Nelson. And it's interesting in that book, he doesn't really talk much about the mass strike of 1919 in Trinidad, even though he'd witnessed it as a kind of teenager himself. It's only really when he became Marxist that he kind of realised the importance of what that mass strike was. And in his experience actually of seeing, I'll come and talk about this actual strike action in Nelson itself, it kind of shifted his perspective. It was a bit of a top-down perspective, that The Life of Captain Cipriani book, I would say. And then he got a chance to do a kind of abridged version of it, aimed at a British audience, called The Case for West Indian Self-Government, which was published in 1933 on the Hogarth Press, which was run by Leonard Woolf, Leonard Woolf, with Virginia Woolf. He ran this progressive press, and it was published there. It was, again, a really quite achievement to get that published aimed at a British audience. And Constantine also encouraged James to get involved with something called the League of Coloured Peoples, which you could see there, which was really an important black-led, basic civil rights kind of organisation against institutional racism in Britain, but also, raising some wider questions about the state of the empire as well, and black people's experience during the empire. And this photo, is James just in 1933 after having left Nelson, but he's been elected to the executive of the League of Coloured Peoples. Constantine had been a supporter of this organisation right from the beginning. I think it was founded in 1931, so it's a fairly new organisation, led by Jamaican Dr. Harold Moody. And James later described how back then he felt like one of the people. He said, "I'd been taught to look. I had an instinctive prejudice against what the establishment and authority was telling me." But he also held this kind of elitist, kind of moralistic, kind of middle-class attitude towards the great mass of working people. And this hadn't been challenged in London, where he spent 10 weeks, and he experienced kind of prejudice and so on. He wrote to the Port of Spain Gazette, he said, "Millions of these people," he's talking about English people, "are still mentally adolescent. They live on cheap films and cheap newspapers. They have this bizarre deference to the great and the good." Thank goodness we've shaken that off. Thank goodness we don't have that anymore. And he said he experienced racism when out and about with young, intelligent white women, and he concluded there remains something in the average Englishman which can only be called sheer blind prejudice. He said the men in particular are usually Philistines. Anyway, so that was his kind of attitudes when he came to Nelson. But these attitudes would change because in Nelson he had an opportunity to meet a wider cross-section of English people than had previously been possible in either Trinidad, where it was kind of the white colonial elite were there, and he taught some of the children of the white colonial elite at this very elite school he got a scholarship to called Queen's Royal College. He taught children of the white colonial elite there. Or in London, as I said, and as Gloria Valère, Constantine's daughter, remembers, "Our home in Nelson was like Grand Central Station. We had lots of visitors." And he remembered some of Constantine's closest friends were humorously cynical working men who would visit the home and found congenial company in me, apart from cricket. Some of the best friends a man could make, I made during my first weeks in Nelson. One of the people he met was Harry Spencer. I think the next slide might be, Harry Spencer, who had inherited this bakery with a tea room upstairs. I don't know where this was. I still haven't found this out. Something.
Scotland Road, I think.
Where?
Scotland Road, I think.
Scotland Road. Okay, well, that's fantastic. I should have. Yeah, that's fantastic. Does it still exist? Does it still exist? Don't know. It'd be interesting.
Oddie's was down there now, and they bought that off a company called Ogden's. So it could have been that one. But Oddie's still have their main bakery now, and they're 105 years old.
Wow.
On the corner, on the roundabout, where the Morrison's there.
But they didn't take that all in the 1930s, did they?
You can take you down there, Christian.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, no. There should be a little plaque, maybe. It should be a little plaque, because it's quite historic. We'll see. We'll come on to this. It's quite historic. So the building's still there. The Spencers, it was Harry Spencer's wife, Elizabeth, ran this bakery and tea room. And they had 3 children at the same school as Gloria. James remembers Harry Spencer was this cultivated man who shared his love of literature, history, and music. They used to go on long walks around. They went over to like York Minster and stuff, and just travelled around the north and together, and actually went to France as well later on in the 30s. And Harry Spencer, February 33 was elected president of Nelson's Chamber of Commerce, a sort of small businessman. But he was why it's so critical, why it's historic, is because James was researching the Haitian Revolution in Nelson, and he was ordering books in and to read. So he was upstairs in deeply reading about the French Revolution, about the Haitian Revolution, and Spencer famously lent CLR James money to go to France in the winter of 1933 to the spring of 1934 to research what became his classic work, Black Jacobins, Toussaint Louverture, and the San Domingo Revolution. from 1938, which has been described as the warm peace of the Caribbean, absolutely magnificent work. And James, when he later would be doing talks, Rise of Black Power, 1960s in America and stuff, often to kind of black nationalist audiences, he would remind them about this aspect of how it had been Harry Spencer that had helped fund the Black Jacobins. And so he said, if anyone calls Harry Spencer whitey, you will find I'm not happy about that. It was kind of interesting. He was challenging some black nationalist ideas. But anyway, James also, while he was there, with researching the Haitian Revolution, amazing, turned the Haitian Revolution, first of all, his research into a play rather than the book. So by 1934, he drafted it into this play, Toussaint Louverture, the story of the only successful slave revolt in history, which got put on in 1936 at Westminster Theatre with Paul Robeson there, great black American actor and singer, film star in the title role. And this was the first time a black professional actor starred on a British stage in a play by a black playwright. And it's the only time I think Robeson starred in a play by a writer of African descent. So it's quite a historic play in terms of Caribbean theatre, black British theatre, and so on. And the play was reviewed in the Nelson Leader by Edna Robinson, who I think was the sister of Joseph Robinson, who's on the other slide. And I'll just read her quick review. She said of the play, she said, "It was a privilege to see the Stage Society's presentation of Mr. James's play in the Westminster Theatre. The story of Toussaint is one of the most dramatic in history. The story of a Negro slave who became leader of a revolution, governor of a colony of over 500,000 people, a general of a French army, and the victim of white treachery, martyr of the cause of Negro liberty. The play opens with plantation slaves pledging themselves to liberty or death, and Toussaint awakening to the call of leadership. In 8 years, they freed the slaves, trained and equipped an army, and reorganised the whole life of the island. Paul Robeson, with his wonderful voice and his acting ability, made Toussaint live again, revealing as the play progressed the genius of statesmanship, the sincerity and wisdom, and the command of the love and loyalty of the people, which was Toussaint's. The play was, of course, ideal for him, and the play as a whole is a fine piece of Negro propaganda, without any of the evidences of the inferiority complex which characterises much of Negro thought today, different and intensely interesting. It shows certain weaknesses of style due to the author's inexperience in playwriting for production, and perhaps also to the wealth of material from which he had to choose in these episodes in the life of a great man. One felt, as one watched and listened, that the word of Reverend Dick Shepherd were not merely a personal tribute to Robeson, when he said, "How can one listen to Paul Robeson and still think in terms of white superiority?" I should say, when I'm reading extracts, some of the language is obviously dated, and in the handout I gave you as well, the language is obviously dated, I should say. But Nelson, obviously, it was a city built on cotton. Manchester Guardian, The Guardian, has been, with Black Lives Matter, obviously woken up to this and kind of done a big thing about cotton capital, haven't they? They've done really important series around slavery and cotton and Manchester and so on like that, which is great. And so Nelson, 1932, was about 38,000 people. Cotton, this meteoric rise of cotton as an industry in Britain during the 19th century, after the development of a power loom in the 1840s in particular, led to these small farming hamlets with easy access to coal and stone and rail lines like Nelson, rapidly growing into small weaving towns. Rural labourers flooded in to work at manufacturing cotton in the new mills, mushrooming up in such areas. And in Nelson, you had existing democratic traditions rooted in religious nonconformity, independent Methodism in particular, which stressed self-government, self-education. And this, together with a large portion of increasingly independent-minded and organised women in the workplace as weavers, meant that political radicalism, which ranged from Gladstonian liberalism to the ethical and idealist socialism of the new Independent Labour Party, the ILP, flourished. As Geoffrey Hill notes, the status of women in Nelson was not structured in inferiority through the operations of a labour market, ensuring a relatively good family wage, which gave Nelson weavers in general, women weavers in particular, a sense of importance and self-confidence, and shaped the distinctive cultural life of the town. And there's a march of Nelson Weavers Association there on this great book, and you can see a lot of women there in the demonstration. And again, so James's conception of working class, you see, was shaped by this idea of women being part of it, from what he saw in Nelson and also in Trinidad, where he'd seen women work and written about women workers, domestic workers, and so on like that. So, but it would have, by the time James arrived in 32, it would have been very far from a bustling little frontier town of perhaps 50 years before. Just as the Lancashire cotton industry had shaped the making of towns such as Nelson, the steady decline and fall of king cotton since the First World War, as a result of rising foreign competition and the contraction of world trade, threatened to be the breaking of these towns. And with the onset of the Great Depression in the 1930s, cotton exports halved in value, capacity in the industry fell, 1 in 3 cotton weavers in the region found themselves thrown on the dole. You had means-tested unemployment benefit as well. Wasn't really much fair support there. 1931, a quarter of Nelson's weavers were out of work. By the time James arrived in 32, local unemployment was still barely below 20%. Darcus Howe is CLR James's great nephew. Remembered CLR James once told him about what he called the poverty of the English working classes in this period, the suffering of it. They had to wrap their feet in cloth. So this is a kind of wake-up experience, isn't it, really? You know, coming to Britain, this you've seen as a great mother country, a home of civilization and everything like that, and seeing poverty, you know, in London and up here as well, like in Trinidad. And so, but he found resistance here, these living traditions of class struggle, socialism, and he soon learned, as he put it, Nelson is a town where most of the working people are pretty closely united. Became known as Red Nelson, even Little Moscow, since 1928 lockout, which was designed to break the power of this militant Nelson Weavers Association. I should mention I'm currently on strike at the moment, Brighton University, where there's mass redundancies taking place. And they're trying to break us in part because we've got a strong trade union, UCU branch where so I'm not, speaking in a personal capacity today, not representing the University of Brighton. Anyway, but these labels of Red Nelson stuck, despite the fact they owed more to this militant trade unionism of the weavers, and this Labour-dominated council, driven by local ILP members, often women, which instituted an effective municipal socialist programme of good housing, rather than the influence of Marxism directly or this tiny local branch of the Communist Party of Great Britain that existed here. As Geoffrey Hill notes, the ILP had fashioned a socialist culture in Nelson which provided entertainment, enjoyment and recreation for politically minded people, and ensured that socialist politics was much to do with the nurturing of good comradeship and moral commitment as with electoral decision making in smoke-filled rooms. There's great traditions of, for example, anti-militarism during and after the First World War. Eric Robinson told me that the guy Richard Bland, who's been a jailed conscientious objector during the Great War, twice became mayor of Nelson. Bland's mayoral services were held at the Palace Theatre because while a devout Christian, he vowed never to enter a church building again in protest of the church's support for the wars. On occasion of a royal visit during his second period of office, Bland resigned the mayoralty rather than receive the monarch's military escort. Pardon? Spot on. Our Vice-Chancellor, who's making all his cuts, has just recently become a Commander of the British Empire, CBE. So much for decolonising the curriculum at the University of Brighton. Anyway, another mayor, Joseph Robinson, who was in my earlier slide, a weaver and secretary of Salem, who also served on the town council for many years. When mayor, he refused to include the Boy Scouts in his mayoral procession in rejection of militarism. I see there's a statue out of Scouts there. Another mayor, Richard Winterbottom, in the late 1920s, banned nationalistic music, including the national anthem, Rule Britannia, Land of Hope and Glory, and God Bless the Prince of Wales. Seems to have died a bit, that song. But anyway, from being played at the local ceremony on Empire Day on the 24th of May. The band was forced to play jazz instead. And a few months later, the Nelson Parks Committee had even imposed a ban on military bands in local parks. So James was so taken by what he started to learn about this local history of working class solidarity and activism. And he related this remarkable story about this recent mass cinema boycott in Nelson to the Reader's Report of Spain Gazette. And again, I dug around, but I couldn't ever find a proper trace of this. So again, something we could talk about in discussion maybe if anyone does know. But cinema had become very popular because, as James put it, for many, apart from the beauties of nature and abiding love of English people, the cinema is the only recreation. Sometimes before James arrived, this company that owned several cinemas in Nelson had tried to cut the wages of their local projector operators, who seemed to have launched this campaign through their union. He says, one day I got into conversation with a quite ordinary person, James remembered, who told him how the whole town of Nelson, so to speak, went on strike. They would not go to the cinema. The pickets were put out in order to turn back those who tried to go. For days, the cinemas played to empty benches. In a town of 40,000 people, you could find sometimes no more than half a dozen in the theatres. The company went bankrupt and had to leave, whereupon local people took over and the theatres began again to be filled. It was magnificent, and it was war. I confessed I was thrilled to the bone when I heard it. I could forgive England all the vulgarity and all the depressing disappointment of London for the magnificent spirit of these North Country working people. As long as that is the stuff of which they're made, then indeed Britons never, never shall be slaves. And these lively stories of working class history directly challenge James's moralistic and elitist Fabian sort of vision of social change from above. He says, discussion with my new friends brought me down to earth. Previously my Labour and socialist ideas had been got from books, rather abstract. And the Labour Party, which he joined, there's an anti-war demonstration again showing that there's cuttings down there of it, 1935, so James returning. This is the run-up to, it's the time of Ethiopia's, Mussolini's war in Ethiopia, and again a fear of a new world war coming there. This is Sidney Silverman addressing a 1936 demonstration at Nelson Football Ground, supporting a weavers' wage demand. So again shows mass working class nature of this. And the Labour Party, particularly in the period, you know, there, I'll skip through some stuff, but basically, yeah, the Labour Party was very left-wing in this period, even more, way more to the left, even what Corbyn, the times of kind of Corbyn, really. You know, they were going to conference in October 1932, backed public ownership of banks, passed a resolution without discussion which declared the main objective of the Labour Party is the establishment of socialism. The conference endorsed a resolution asking that on assuming office, either with or without power, definite socialist legislation must be immediately promulgated. The party will stand and fall in the House of Commons on the principles in which it has faith. And in this crisis, because the Labour Party shifted left after the disastrous period of the Ramsay-MacDonald government, 29 to 31, which had to resign after they pushed through cuts in unemployment benefit. Ramsay-MacDonald went off and joined the Tories and became part of the national government. The Labour Party, what was left, shifted to the left massively. And so this was part of this wider crisis, reflecting kind of capitalism at this time. While James was there, he read Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, which is really important. Frederick Cartmel lent him a copy of this, and James, this was absolutely fascinating for James as a history teacher, and also Trotsky's literary style, and it started to push him way more towards think about Marx. And the other book he read while in Nelson was Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, which did challenge many Eurocentric tenets from the perspective of world history. It was also prophetic because it talked about the rise of strongmen, and given this was the 1930s with fascism on the rise, Mussolini, Hitler, it was seen as, wow, this guy knows what he's talking about. So those two books, and James said he reread these tremendous tomes. He was late. There's this humorous story I'll just relate while James was upstairs reading and trying to get to grips with this big crisis of the system. His daughter Gloria recalled this incident where he said, my mother, Norma, and I were in the living room, and his bedroom was directly above the living room. My mother said to me, do you smell something burning? And I said, I think so. She said, oh my goodness, and she went up the stairs. There is Nello, CLR James, very busy writing or doing something, or reading or doing something, sitting in a cardigan near an electric fire, and his cardigan is on fire. And when my mother pointed out to him, Nello, you are on fire, he said, oh my goodness, but he hadn't got a clue. He's got his head in the clouds, really, James, this time. And then you've got this great Lancashire cotton strike, which takes place in August 32, and there's it's a mass demonstrations on 29th August 1932. 16,000 Nelson cotton workers go on strike, bring the town to a complete halt. It rages for over a month over Lancashire, a timely reminder of the power and resourcefulness of the working class for James. And they organised this 8th of September, Nelson Labour Party organised a demonstration in solidarity with the strikers. It's likely James joined it. again, showing their best traditions of kind of solidarity and the way in which it's kind of is such a radical place. It kind of gives James a vision of what England, a kind of almost post-colonial England could be potentially like once the empire's gone. You know, what kind of vision, alternative vision of England could be once the empire's gone, and working people have a sense of power. And James would speak around West. You know, I've got to give you some of the extracts there. Those gotten, but he gives these speeches, and he goes around and talks to audiences around about the empire. And as you've showed in that video, Constantine was often afraid to be too political. So James would speak, and you can trace this kind of radicalisation in those speeches to the left. But he's talking to them about, you know, his hopes in Labour government, again, you know, potentially doing something to end imperialism and decolonise, I guess. And he says, you know, the Lancashire workers said, you make a mistake when you look to the Labour Party. He said, Ramsay MacDonald, Arthur Henderson, Philip Snowden, Herbert Morrison, they never gave us anything and we put them there. Why do you think they would give you anything? You can't even vote for them. And he says, answers to questions like this, you know, demanded serious attention from James. And he remembers, while I was a Labour Party man, increasingly I found myself to the left of the Labour Party in Nelson, militant as that was. And so he started to push and be more speculative about how you're going to get the end of empire, really. Is it going to come through a Labour government coming in, or is it going to take the struggles of people themselves and anti-imperialists there? And his speeches tap into this rich vein of anti-imperialism in Nelson. It was an audience, after all, his grandparents may well have taken part in the boycott of cotton from the southern states during the American Civil War of the 1860s, whose parents objected to schools being closed to celebrate the relief of Math King and the Boer War, on the grounds that for children to associate rejoicing and holiday making with war and bloodshed was distinctly immoral. And it was an audience who themselves may have marched against British intervention in the First World War and in Russia, Soviet Russia afterwards, and who now supported Gandhi's boycott of imported British cotton. And so gives a sense of Britain as, say, without empire. So it's not to say there aren't challenges that experienced, or James didn't experience any kind of, you know, potential prejudice there. But the point is, he had a very different experience, and he was reading Trotsky there in this context of depression, and I think what I argue is really, yes, the ordinary people have read Nelson, but really critical to James's turn to socialism and socialist politics. I'll end with this, but E.P. Thompson once said that when it was James's 80th birthday, 1981, he said, CLR James was like Tom Mann, but he hoped to get more dangerous as he got older. And Thompson, I think, is right, because James gave his 80th birthday lectures to the Race Today collective, Dark as Howard. When someone suggested him in those lectures that he said the British working class was somehow too backward, not educated enough for socialism, James, the great socialist, would point out on the contrary that it was his working class friends in Nelson that helped to educate him. And once James left Nelson to begin professional work as a cricketer, despite harbouring dreams still of making it as a novelist, he didn't try and now ingratiate himself with the literary elite in Bloomsbury on his return to London. Instead, as he vividly once recalled, Hitler came to power in 1933. The contemporary world had been swept into political life. I got swept into politics. And this is marked basically the rest of James's life, really, fundamentally, as a political thinker, campaigner, anti-colonialist, Pan-Africanist, kind of Marxist. So I'll end there. Thank you.